The shy billionaire's fiancé accused the maid of stealing, but his baby boy's toy exposed the shocking truth. Mama, are they going to put you in jail? The tiny voice cut through the tension in the grand marble hallway of the Carter estate like a knife through silk. 3-year-old Ava Jackson pressed her small brown fingers against her mother's uniform, her enormous dark eyes swimming with tears she was too frightened to let fall. She had heard the word thief thrown around the room like a thunderbolt, and even though she didn't fully understand what it meant, she understood one thing perfectly: her mama was in trouble. Naomi Jackson knelt down slowly, her knees trembling beneath the crisp black and white maid's uniform she had ironed with such care just that morning. She cupped her daughter's face in both hands, hands that had scrubbed floors, polished silverware, folded thousand-thread count sheets, and never, not once, taken a single thing that didn't belong to them. She looked into Ava's eyes and forced the most steady smile she could find buried somewhere beneath the avalanche of humiliation crushing her chest. "Baby, look at Mama," she whispered softly. "Mama didn't do anything wrong. You hear me? Nothing wrong." Ava sniffled. "Then why is that lady so mad?" Behind them, the lady in question, Olivia Grant, fiancée of billionaire William Carter, stood in the center of the estate's sprawling living room with her arms crossed and her perfectly painted lips pressed into a thin, victorious line. She was draped in a cream cashmere wrap dress that probably cost more than 3 months of Naomi's salary, and every strand of her highlighted blonde hair was in its precise, appointed place. She looked like someone who had never been wrong a day in her life and fully intended to keep that record intact. "I don't know why you're whispering to that child like this is some kind of bedtime story, Naomi," Olivia said, her voice dripping with a particular brand of cruelty that disguises itself as calm. "The diamond bracelet is missing. You were the only staff member in the East Wing this morning. It's really not a complicated equation." The room held its breath. The Carter estates head housekeeper, Margaret, a silver-haired woman of 60 who had worked in this house for 22 years, stood near the doorway with her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her expression pained. 2 other household staff members, Diego and Priya, lingered near the kitchen entrance, eyes downcast, afraid to speak, afraid to breathe too loudly. And then there was William Carter himself. He stood slightly apart from Olivia, near the large bay window that overlooked the sprawling estate gardens, one hand resting on the windowsill, the other cradling his 9-month-old son, Ethan, against his chest. Ethan, blissfully unbothered by the adult storm raging around him, was busy shaking a colorful plastic rattle, red and yellow, with a smiley face painted on it, and gurgling with a pure, uncomplicated joy that only babies are permitted to feel. William Carter was not what most people expected when they pictured a billionaire. He was quiet, thoughtful, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke and noticed more than people realized. He had built his tech empire not through bravado or loud boardroom theatrics, but through careful observation and an almost preternatural ability to read situations, read people, read the truth beneath the performance. Right now, he was reading the room. He watched Naomi hold her daughter. He watched the way Naomi's hands, steady, gentle, sure, grounded that little girl even in the middle of her own storm. He had known Naomi Jackson for 2 years. She had come to work at the Carter estate as a single mother, references impeccable, manner quiet and dignified, work ethic beyond reproach. In 2 years, she had never been late, never broken anything, never complained. And she had been, though William had never said this aloud, one of the few people in this house who treated Ethan like a person rather than a prop. "Olivia," William said, his voice low and even. "You said the bracelet went missing this morning?" "This morning, yes. While I was at my spa appointment. I left it on the vanity in the East Wing dressing room, and when I came back, it was gone." Olivia's eyes flickered briefly toward Naomi. "And she was cleaning in there." "I cleaned the East Wing, yes," Naomi said, rising to her feet, keeping Ava close behind her legs. Her voice was quiet, but it did not shake. I dusted the vanity, cleaned the mirror, vacuumed the carpet, and changed the towels. I did not touch the bracelet. I didn't even pick it up to clean under it. I worked around it. That's very convenient, Olivia said sweetly. It's the truth, Naomi replied. The word hung in the air between them. Simple, clean, undecorated. Truth. It didn't need anything else added to it. Ava tugged on her mother's uniform again. Mama, she said, very quietly, pressing her face against Naomi's hip, I'm scared. And there it was. That tiny sentence did what no amount of adult argumentation could do in that moment. It reached into William Carter's chest and grabbed something essential. He looked down at Ethan in his arms, his own son, who was still rattling that silly toy with absolute delight, completely unaware that a woman's entire dignity was being dismantled 6 feet away from him. William thought about what it would feel like for Ethan to one day be frightened, to look up at him with those big, trusting eyes and say, Daddy, I'm scared. And he thought about what kind of man he would want Ethan to see in that moment. The man who stood still and let injustice play out because it was easier, or the man who did something. Nobody is going anywhere, William said, and this time his voice carried the particular quiet authority that had once made a boardroom full of venture capitalists fall completely silent. We're going to figure out exactly what happened. Olivia blinked. A flicker of something, not quite worry, but its distant cousin, crossed her face before she smoothed it back into confidence. William, I really don't think this requires. Margaret, he said, not unkindly, please bring Ava to the kitchen and get her something to eat. The good cookies. The ones in the blue tin. Margaret's face softened with visible relief. She crossed the room and gently took Ava's little hand, and when Ava looked up at her mother for permission, Naomi nodded, and for just one moment, the smallest ghost of safety crossed that 3-year-old's face. William watched them go. Then he looked down at Ethan again, at that cheerful red and yellow rattle going shake, shake, shake in his chubby fist. And some quiet, instinctive certainty, began to stir at the back of William Carter's mind. Olivia Grant had not always been this way. There was a version of her story that could earn sympathy, and she knew exactly how to tell it when the occasion called for it. She had grown up in a middle-class family in suburban Connecticut, the daughter of a father who had once been modestly successful and then, through a series of bad investments and worse decisions, had become rather ordinary. Olivia had grown up watching her mother adjusting her expectations, adjusting her wardrobe to look expensive when it wasn't, adjusting her smile to hide the particular shame of having once had more. Olivia had learned those adjustments too. She had perfected them, actually, turned them into an art form. She was beautiful in the way that required significant maintenance, and she was charming in the way that required significant calculation. She had moved through her 20s collecting the right friends, attending the right events, wearing the right things, saying the right words to the right people, climbing the invisible but very real ladder of proximity to wealth. And then she had met William Carter at a charity gala 3 years ago, and the ladder had become a rocket ship. William was not easy to charm. That had been the first surprise. Most wealthy men she had encountered were, at their core, rather simple to manage, offer the right amount of admiration, the right amount of beautiful mystery, and they became remarkably pliable. William was different. He was quiet and observant, and he had a way of looking at people that made Olivia feel uncomfortably, like he was reading something in her she hadn't intended to leave on the page. But she had been patient, and eventually, she had found the key to William Carter. He was lonely. Not in the obvious, desperate way that made a man easy prey, but in the deep, structural way of a man who had spent so long building something enormous that he had neglected to build the human scaffolding around it. His marriage to Ethan's mother, Clara, had ended quietly 2 years before Olivia met him. Clara had been lovely but fragile, and the pressure of William's world had eventually been too much. She had moved to Portland with a generous settlement and generous shared custody arrangement, and she and William remained, genuinely, kind to each other from a careful distance. William had Ethan every other week, and in those weeks, Olivia had noticed early on he was a different man.
Softer.
More present. The tight economy of his attention relaxed into something warmer, more generous. He talked to Ethan with the earnestness of someone who had not yet learned to be guarded with another human being. Olivia had understood then that the path to William ran directly through Ethan. So she had been wonderful with the baby, in front of William. Cooing and attentive and effortlessly maternal. It had worked beautifully. What Olivia had not fully calculated was Naomi Jackson. From the beginning, Naomi had been a quiet inconvenience. Not because she was unfriendly, she was perfectly polite, but because she was the kind of woman whose very existence was a kind of mirror, and Olivia did not enjoy what she saw reflected. Naomi had nothing. She was raising a child alone on a maid's salary, living in a small apartment across town, taking 2 buses to get to work each morning. And yet she moved through this grand estate with a dignity that Olivia, with all her cashmere and diamonds and carefully curated elegance, could never quite manufacture. William noticed Naomi. Not romantically. Olivia had watched carefully for that, and found nothing to confirm it. He noticed her the way decent people notice other decent people, with a quiet recognition and respect. He knew her daughter's name. He asked about Ava occasionally. Small things, but they added up to something that bothered Olivia in a way she couldn't neatly articulate. The bracelet had gone missing. That much was true. It was a diamond tennis bracelet, a gift William had given her at Christmas, worth nearly $40,000. She had left it in the dressing room, and when she returned from her spa appointment, it wasn't in the spot she remembered placing it. The difference between Olivia and an honest person was this. An honest person, upon finding something missing, first considers whether they themselves might have misplaced it. Olivia, upon finding something missing, first considered how this might be useful. And it was useful. It was, in fact, almost perfectly useful. Because accusing Naomi gave Olivia something she had been looking for, a reason, socially acceptable and righteous sounding, to have Naomi removed from this house. Away from William's quiet noticing. Away from the mirror. She had made the accusation with her heart entirely calm, her voice perfectly modulated to sound wounded rather than calculating. She had watched the color drain from Naomi's face and felt a sharp, shameful thing that she quickly reclassified as justified. What she had not counted on was William's silence. Usually when Olivia presented a version of events, William deferred, not because he was weak, but because he chose his battles carefully and preferred to let small things go in the interest of peace. But today he was not deferring. He was standing at that window with that baby on his hip, looking at Naomi with an expression Olivia couldn't quite read, and the quality of his silence was different from usual. It had weight to it. It had intention. And Ethan, that ridiculous, gurgling 9-month-old, was still shaking that rattle. Shake, 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 as if he were quietly keeping time on something none of the adults could yet see coming. There was something William had never told anyone about the rattle. Ethan had received it 6 weeks ago, not as a gift from a relative or a purchase from a baby boutique, but as part of a small, quiet project William had undertaken after an incident that still troubled him. 3 months prior, one of the estate's outdoor security cameras had been tampered with. It was minor, a repositioning that left a blind spot near the east wing entrance, and the security company had attributed it to a contractor accidentally bumping the housing during routine maintenance. William had accepted this explanation outwardly, while privately finding it insufficient. He was, at his core, an engineer, a man who built systems and thought in structures of cause and effect. An accident could shift a camera slightly. The camera had been shifted precisely. He hadn't said anything to Olivia. He hadn't said anything to anyone. He had, instead, quietly asked his head of security, a dry, discreet man named Aldrich, to look into small-format interior monitoring options. Not the obvious kind. The embedded kind. Aldrich had come back with several options, one of which was, technically, a baby toy, A brightly colored rattle fitted with a micro lens behind one of the painted eyes of the smiley face, connected to a compact storage module no larger than a thick coin. It had been designed, apparently, for anxious parents who wanted to monitor nannies and couldn't use obvious cameras due to household trust concerns. The resolution was modest but functional. The battery lasted 72 hours. The footage stored internally and could be transferred via a small magnetic dock to any device. William had felt mildly ridiculous ordering it. He had told himself it was just a precaution, a prudent, temporary measure to put his own mind at ease, after which he would find nothing suspicious and quietly retire the whole experiment. He had placed the rattle in Ethan's toy basket, and Ethan, with the magnificent impartiality of infancy, had accepted it as enthusiastically as every other rattle in his collection. This morning, when the accusation had erupted in the living room, William's mind had made the connection with a sudden, almost physical clarity. The rattle had been in the sitting room adjacent to the East Wing dressing room this morning. He remembered this specifically because he had been doing a working breakfast at the small writing desk in that sitting room while Ethan played on the floor mat. He had been in there for nearly 2 hours. And at some point, before his 11 o'clock call, he had moved Ethan and the toys to the living room. The rattle had been recording. For the past 6 weeks, it had been recording snippets of daily estate life. Brief, fragmentary, mostly mundane. He had checked it twice, found nothing of note, and had almost forgotten about it. But this morning it had been in that sitting room, which shared a half-open connecting door with the East Wing dressing room. William kept his face composed. He kept his breathing even. He was very good at this, at holding enormous things inside a calm exterior while his mind worked at full speed. It was how he had built his company. It was how he had navigated every significant crisis of his professional life. He looked at Ethan. Ethan looked back at him with those wide, pellucid eyes, dark like his mother Clara's, fringed with lashes that were honestly unfair, and then went back to the rattle. Shake, shake, shake. William. Olivia's voice had taken on an edge of impatience dressed as concern. I really do think we should contact the agency that placed Naomi and let them handle this through the proper channels. It doesn't have to be ugly. It can be very quiet and professional. Very quiet. Very professional. In other words, gone, without a scene, without anyone looking too closely. I'd like to review the morning footage first, William said. Olivia's eyes moved to him. The security cameras don't cover the interior rooms. You've said that yourself, for privacy reasons. I know, William said. And then he looked down at the rattle in Ethan's hand. He held out his palm toward Ethan, a gesture the baby knew well. Give it here for a minute, buddy. And Ethan, with the charming compliance of a child who trusts completely, placed the rattle in his father's hand, and then immediately looked around for something else to grab. William closed his fingers around the rattle. He could feel the slight difference in weight on one side where the module sat. He looked at it for just a moment, that cheerful painted smiley face, those ridiculous dots for eyes, one of which was not a dot at all. He raised his eyes to the room. Naomi was standing very still, her hands folded in front of her, her face a portrait of controlled endurance. She had the look of a person who has been asked to prove an unprovable negative, to demonstrate the absence of guilt in a room that has already made up its mind, and who is nonetheless refusing to crumble. There was a nobility to it that struck William somewhere deep. Margaret had returned from the kitchen and was standing near the doorway again, her silver head slightly bowed. Diego and Priya were still silent at the kitchen entrance. Olivia was watching William with those careful, calibrated eyes of hers. I'll be back in about 5 minutes, William said. Where are you going? Olivia asked. To get my laptop, he said simply, which was true. He handed Ethan to Margaret. Watch him a moment, please, and walked through the East Wing hallway to his private study, the rattle held lightly in his hand, his heart beating with a particular, deliberate calm. He sat down at his desk. He retrieved the small magnetic dock from the locked drawer where he kept it. He pressed it to the module housing on the underside of the rattle. A small light blinked twice, green, green, and on his laptop screen, the transfer window opened. He navigated to the morning's footage. He found the timestamp. He pressed play. And at 9:47 in the morning, through a slightly fish-eyed, modest-resolution micro-lens, William Carter watched the truth walk into the room and introduce itself. The image was not cinematic. It was small and slightly grainy, the color a little flat, the angle low, consistent with a toy sitting on a floor mat in the adjacent sitting room, pointed toward the half-open connecting door. But it was clear enough. It was absolutely, undeniably clear enough. William watched it twice. The first time, he felt something cold and clarifying move through him, the sensation he associated with the moment a complex problem resolves itself, when all the ambiguous data suddenly aligns and the answer is not what you hoped but is at least finally certain. The second time, he was looking for details. He found them. He closed the laptop. He sat for a moment in the quiet of his study, the room where he had negotiated acquisitions and navigated crises and made decisions that affected thousands of people, and he thought about what it meant to have been this close to someone, and this far from seeing them clearly. He thought about his son. He thought about Naomi Jackson standing in that living room with her hands folded and her dignity intact, carrying an accusation she had not earned. He thought about Ava, sitting in the kitchen eating cookies from the blue tin, probably asking Margaret gentle, careful questions about what was happening to her mama. He stood up. He picked up the laptop. He walked back to the living room. The room looked exactly as he had left it, the same arrangement of people, the same coiled tension, except that Ethan was now on the floor play mat that Margaret had apparently retrieved from the nursery, happily investigating a set of stacking rings with the focused intensity of a very small scientist. William set the laptop on the large coffee table at the center of the room. "I'd like everyone to see something," he said. His voice was quiet, unremarkable, but something in it, some quality of absolute stillness, made every person in the room come to attention. Olivia tilted her head slightly. "William, what is this about?" "I really think—" "Please," he said. Just the one word. She fell silent. He opened the laptop. He turned it so the screen faced the room. He pressed play. For the first 3 seconds, there was nothing remarkable, just the half-open doorway, the soft light of the East Wing dressing room visible through it, the edge of the vanity in the frame. You could see the glimmer of something on the vanity surface. The bracelet, catching the morning light. Then Naomi appeared in the frame. She moved with her usual efficient quietness, spray bottle, cloth, the vanity surface cleaned in broad, careful strokes. She worked around the bracelet. You could see her deliberately shift her cleaning path to avoid it, the way an honest person avoids touching something that doesn't belong to them. She replaced the bottles, straightened the surface, and left the frame. The bracelet still glimmered on the vanity. The room was absolutely silent. Then, 7 minutes later, someone else entered the frame. Olivia. She was in her cream cashmere wrap dress. She moved differently from Naomi, not with efficiency but with a kind of furtive, sideways energy. She glanced back toward the doorway. She picked up the bracelet. She held it for a moment, turning it over in her fingers. And then, with the particular quick economy of motion that belongs to people doing something they know is wrong, she opened her small clutch purse and slipped it inside. She snapped the purse shut. She took one more look around the room. And she left. The timestamp read 9:54 a.m., 17 minutes before she would return from her spa appointment and report the bracelet missing. William pressed pause. The silence in the room was the most profound silence he had ever heard. It lasted, perhaps, for seconds. And then Olivia said, "That footage could have been," and stopped, because even she could hear that there was no sentence available to her that would survive contact with what everyone in the room had just seen with their own eyes. Margaret's hand had come up to cover her mouth. Diego and Priya stood frozen in the kitchen doorway.
Naomi.
Naomi had not moved. She stood exactly where she had been standing, her hands still folded in front of her, but something had changed in her face. Not triumph, Not vindication in the theatrical sense, but something quieter and more profound. The particular, bone-deep relief of a person who has held their integrity under enormous pressure and been permitted, finally, to put the weight down. Her eyes were bright. She was not going to cry. Naomi Jackson was not a woman who cried easily, and certainly not here, not in front of these people. But the brightness was there, and it said everything words couldn't carry. And across the room, on his play mat, Ethan picked up the rattle that had been returned to his basket. He shook it cheerfully. Shake, shake, shake. In another context, it might have been funny. In this room, in this moment, it sounded almost like justice keeping its own small, delighted rhythm. "I want you to leave," William said. He was looking at Olivia. His voice had not risen. It did not need to. There is a particular kind of authority that lives in perfect quiet, and William Carter possessed it completely. Olivia opened her mouth. Something moved across her face. Panic first, then calculation, then the practiced pivot to wounded dignity. "William, I think you're overreacting. I was confused about where I had put it, and I shouldn't have been so quick to." "Olivia." His voice was still quiet, still even. "I watched you put it in your purse. On camera. Before your appointment. You came home and reported it stolen, knowing that Naomi had been in that room, knowing what the implication would be." He paused. "You knew exactly what you were doing." The room held its breath again. Olivia's composure did something then that it had probably never done in her adult life. It cracked. Not dramatically, not in tears or shouting, but in a subtle, irreversible way. The careful architecture of her self-presentation showed its seams. Her chin lifted in the reflexive posture of someone who has survived on the offense and cannot locate the defense. "You can't be serious about choosing a maid over your fiancé," she said, and her voice had an edge in it now, something harder beneath the injured elegance. "I'm not choosing a maid," William said. "I'm choosing honesty." He looked at her steadily. "And for what it's worth, I should have been paying closer attention for a long time. That's on me." It was, in its way, the most devastating thing he could have said, not that she was caught, not that she had to leave, but that he had been inattentive and was now correcting that. It removed her from the center of the story entirely. It made her not a villain to be confronted, but an error to be corrected, and for a woman who had devoted enormous energy to being central and essential, that was a blow from which there was no graceful recovery. Olivia looked around the room once, at Margaret's carefully neutral face, at Diego and Priya's averted eyes, at Naomi standing quietly in her black and white uniform with her hands finally at her sides. She looked at Ethan on his play mat, who looked back at her with the cheerful, uncommitted interest of infancy. She did not look at the rattle. "I'll have my things collected," she said. Her voice was perfectly controlled. She had that, at least. She walked out of the living room, her heels precise against the marble floor, her posture immaculate, her exit the last performance she would give in this house. The front door opened. The front door closed. The sound of it echoed briefly in the high-ceilinged hallway and then dissolved. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Margaret quietly excused herself to go bring Ava back from the kitchen, and Diego and Priya disappeared back to their duties with a slightly dazed efficiency of people grateful to have something to do with their hands. And William Carter turned to Naomi Jackson. He stood across the room from her. This woman who had stood in the center of a false accusation for the better part of an hour and had not broken, had not begged or performed or wept or raged, but had simply held her ground with the quiet strength of someone who knows the truth about themselves and understands, at the most fundamental level, that no one else's words can change it. He didn't entirely know what to say. He was, as Olivia had correctly identified years ago, a shy man. Not in the timid sense, but in the sense of someone whose deepest responses traveled inward before they surfaced outward. He processed in silence. He felt in private. But some things were too important for silence. "Naomi," he said. "Mr. Carter," she replied, still formal, still professional, still herself. "I owe you an apology." She looked at him, a slight surprise moving through her eyes. I should have, he paused. I should have said immediately that I didn't believe it. I should have been clearer, faster. I wasn't, and I'm sorry for that. You deserved better from me. Naomi was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was low and careful. You found the truth, Mr. Carter. That matters. It shouldn't have needed finding, he said. A beat passed between them, not uncomfortable, but weighted with the honest acknowledgement of an imperfect situation in which a good man had moved too slowly and a good woman had paid the cost of his hesitation. These were the truths they could stand in together, without pretense. Your job is yours for as long as you want it, William said. With a raise, effective immediately. And I would like Margaret to send something to Ava, whatever she'd like from the kitchen. Whatever she'd like, full stop. Naomi's lips pressed together briefly, that bright shimmer again in her eyes. Thank you, she said quietly. And then the kitchen door swung open, and Ava came running across the marble floor in her little shoes, her face still slightly tear-stained but transformed now by the uncomplicated animal joy of a child who has been given cookies and is now being reunited with her mother. She threw herself at Naomi's legs with the full, unreserved commitment of a 3-year-old, and Naomi bent down and caught her and lifted her up in one fluid motion, holding her close, pressing her face against Ava's small shoulder. Mama, Ava said, into her neck, Margaret gave me the chocolate ones. Did she? Naomi managed. And a juice box, Ava said very seriously. The good kind. And Naomi Jackson laughed, a real laugh, quiet and sudden and full, the kind of laugh that surfaces when an enormous weight lifts unexpectedly, and she held her daughter and let herself feel, just for one moment, the luxury of being all right. That evening, after the house had settled into its quieter rhythms and Ethan had been bathed and fed and rocked to sleep in his nursery, William Carter sat in the chair beside his son's crib and watched him breathe. It was one of his favorite things. He had discovered this about himself after Ethan was born, that he could sit here in the dim nursery with its soft nightlight and its subtle smell of baby shampoo and just watch his son sleep, and experience something that his otherwise relentlessly analytical mind had no precise category for. It wasn't just love, though it was certainly that. It was something closer to awe, the particular, humbling awe of being responsible for something this complete, this trusting, this entirely itself. Ethan slept with his arms flung above his head in the classic baby position that looks, to adult eyes, like a tiny person in the permanent state of saying I give up, but which actually just means I am so safe that I don't need to protect myself. His lips were slightly parted. His lashes rested against his cheeks. On the shelf above his crib, among the other soft toys and board books, sat the rattle, red and yellow, smiling its cheerful, painted smile. William looked at it for a long time. He thought about what it meant that this small, ridiculous object had been the instrument of justice today. He had bought it out of quiet suspicion and mild embarrassment, thinking of it as a temporary, somewhat paranoid precaution, and it had turned out to be, in the most unexpected and specific way, exactly the right tool in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. There was something almost parable-like about it, though William was not a man given to parables. He was a man given to systems. But sometimes systems produce outcomes that feel, undeniably, like something more than engineering. He thought about Naomi. He had known, in the abstract way of a fair-minded person, that Naomi Jackson was honest and good at her job and deserved to be treated with respect. But today he had seen something more specific, had seen what she was made of in the specific crucible of being accused of something she hadn't done, with her daughter watching in a room full of people who could easily have looked the other way. He had seen that she was someone who held her integrity, not as a performance but as a foundation, the thing she stood on rather than the thing she displayed. He thought about Olivia. This was harder. He had known, somewhere beneath his conscious choosing, that something was not quite right. He had felt it in small ways, in the calculated quality of her warmth, in the slight delay between her emotional expressions and whatever was actually happening in her eyes, in the way her kindness toward Ethan was always somehow perfectly timed to an audience. He had known, and he had not looked directly at the knowing because looking directly at the knowing would have required doing something about it. That was on him. He could see that clearly now. He was a man who had survived significant professional betrayal and had responded by building better safeguards, better systems, better vetting, better early warning mechanisms. He had been rigorous about this in business and careless about it in love, which was perhaps the most human imbalance imaginable, but was still an imbalance he needed to correct. He had let himself want something simple so much, a partner, a family, a life that was warm as well as accomplished, that he had allowed wanting to substitute for seeing. He would not make that mistake again. Ethan stirred slightly in his sleep, some small dream moving through him, and then resettled with a soft exhale. William leaned forward and very gently placed his hand over his son's small chest, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. "You did good today, buddy," he thought. Which was absurd, of course. Ethan had done nothing today except be 9 months old and charming and delightfully unconscious of the drama surrounding him. But the rattle had been in his hand, and his hand had carried it through the morning, and something about that felt worth acknowledging, even privately, even in the wordless language of a father alone with his sleeping son. Across town, in a small but clean apartment, Naomi Jackson was putting Ava to bed. This took considerably longer than putting Ethan to bed because Ava had questions, many, elaborate, interconnected questions about the day, about the lady who had been mean to Mama, about why William had shown something on his computer and the lady had left, about whether they would be going back tomorrow, and whether Margaret would have more chocolate cookies. Naomi answered each question carefully, at the level of honest and appropriate detail that a 3-year-old could hold. She said that sometimes people say things that aren't true, and that even when that happens and it's scary, the truth has a way of coming out. She said that Mr. Carter was a fair man. She said that yes, they would be going back tomorrow. "Because you didn't do anything wrong," Ava said, arriving at this conclusion with the simple certainty of a child who has processed the day's events and reached a verdict. "That's right," Naomi said. "And the baby's toy knew," Ava said. Naomi paused. "Something like that, baby." Ava considered this with the profound 3-year-old seriousness it apparently deserved, and then she said, "Mama, I think babies know a lot of things." Naomi pulled the blanket up around her daughter's chin. She pressed a long kiss to her forehead, breathing in the warm, uncomplicated smell of her child, shampoo and something sweetly underneath that was just Ava, just entirely, irreplaceably Ava. "I think you might be right," she said softly. She turned off the light. She sat in the doorway for a moment, watching her daughter settle into sleep with the same flung-arm abandon as Ethan, across town, in his nursery. And she felt, not vindication exactly, and not victory, but something softer and more sustaining than either of those things. She felt that the world, imperfect and complicated and sometimes cruel, was still capable of doing the right thing. That truth still had some force in it. That showing up, every day, with honesty and dignity intact, was not naive, was not, as she had feared in the worst moments of that living room, a kind of foolishness, but was in fact the most powerful position a person could occupy. She felt that her daughter had seen something important today. Not the accusation. She hoped Ava would eventually let that fade. But what came after? She had seen her mother stand firm. She had seen the truth emerge. She had seen a man choose correctly. These were things worth seeing. Back in the Carter Estate nursery, William finally rose from his chair. He tucked the blanket more snugly around Ethan's small shoulders. He stood for a moment looking at his son. Tomorrow there would be things to sort out. Practical things, logistical things, the quiet legal and personal unwinding of an engagement that had turned out to be built on a foundation he hadn't examined closely enough. There would be conversations and decisions, and the ordinary hard work of rearranging a life that had been organized around a version of the future that no longer existed. But tonight, in the soft light of the nursery, there was just this, his son's steady breathing, and the rattle on the shelf, and the knowledge that today, in this house, Something true had been protected. He reached up and very gently touched the painted smile on the rattle's face. Thank you, he thought. To the rattle. To Ethan. To whatever combination of intention and accident and ordinary human decency had put the right thing in the right place at the right moment. Then he turned off the nursery light and walked quietly down the hall, leaving his son to dream in the safe, warm dark, while the rattle sat on its shelf and smiled its small, painted, utterly contented smile, keeping its secret the way good things do, quietly and without any need for praise. Some truths don't announce themselves. They just sit patiently in the room, waiting for someone to finally look. And when the right person does, when a shy billionaire finally holds the weight of a small toy in his hand and understands what it's been carrying, even the tiniest instruments of honesty turn out to be more than enough. They always were.
The end.